Hello, this is Stuck in the Middle with You, and I'm your host, Thomas Cornish,
And I'm Bam Kovacs.
and he is my co-host for today's podcast.
Yes.
And today we're going to talk about the topic of evolution.
Indeed, it's a pretty big topic.
Pretty big topic, consumes us all. It has, air quotes, created us all, if you will allow me that extravagance.
Created? Well, it seems intelligent.
We'll possibly come to that. So I'll open with an opening statement. So every scintilla of biological life has come to be, or is, because of a simple mechanism in which, in 1859, Charles Darwin described. He described, in effect, an algorithm of life entailing that all species and organisms arise through a process of natural selection or small inherited morphologies that will either render the organism unable to reproduce or will accentuate this ability to survive, strive, and reproduce. Okay, so on that note, let's talk about evolution and its algorithm and possibly genes. So bam.
So I think with such an already decided context for evolution to be in, many people have different ideas about what evolution is. It's important to say that evolution has got nothing to do with genes. Genes have got everything to do with evolution, because when people say evolution, if you're going to use it in an argument, they think, well, okay, so you're talking genetic dynamics here, and that's just not true. You can't point, in my opinion, to anything and say there wasn't evolution there. Everything, whether it's a table, whether it's yourself, whether it's culture, if you can point to a culture, everything's got evolution behind it in some way, shape, or form. Loads of different theories to explain absolutely everything.
Yeah, so the real salient way to think about evolution is to think about it as an algorithm, and that requires a replicator or a unit that can replicate. So there we have genes, but it could be anything that conceivably replicates.
Yeah, absolutely anything, and it is an algorithm. That's, I think, the best way to think about it.
It's an algorithm, and it's
self-replicating.
Yeah, self-replicating units, and the kind of environment in genetic terms deems what is going to replicate more successfully and what is going to replicate at a lesser degree or a lesser extent, or may even eventually die out.
And even how the replicator replicates, the environment states what the best way to replicate is.
Yeah. So, for instance, you have a set of genes and they can replicate. Also, to be a good replicator and to operate in evolution space, a replicator would need to have mutations to change.
The right amount of
and improve.
Mutations.
Yeah,
which can also be very dynamic.
So
usually a very small amount of replication, and I think there's three different categories for a good replicator to succeed. It's got to be it's got to have high fidelity, fecundity, and something else as well, which I can't really remember. But fidelity and fecundity, it's much like language as well, where you can see language as being very evolutionary because it's got the trademark, the hallmarks of evolutionary dynamics, because it's got very good replicator value, where if you replicate it, then it will be the exact same than what it was. Of course, that's all up to change. It could be good for a replicator to not have very good, consistency, and it might need to have a really high mutation rate.
Absolutely, yeah. If you have these replicators encapsulated in a particular environment that happens to be volatile, then to gain an understanding of what trait is the best or what set of genes is the best to survive within that environment, you would need a replicator that is initially very volatile also, that has mutations going on every which way, and then eventually the the bad genes, will be winnowed. Winnowed out is the term.
Yes. Yeah.
So pruned out, taken away. That's what we mean by winnowing out.
Of course, if the mutation rate is too high, then you land up with just as many bad genes as good genes, because the good genes land up mutating and becoming bad genes again.
Yeah.
So it's a trade-off. You have to have a very specific amount of mutation.
And so Darwin realized this. He basically, his great insight was realizing this was practically an algorithm applied to replicators. He didn't have that vocabulary yet.
Yeah.
He spoke in terms
before
of
the discovery of genes.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, which makes it like an even
phenomenal.
A phenomenal discovery.
Yeah.
He spoke in terms of natural selection and phenotypes and genotypes. Well, not genotypes yet, not even phenotypes yet. He spoke of natural selection and slight differences in physical apparatus being passed on, and slight differences that were conducive to the environment being winnowed out.
Yeah.
And he discovered this on the Galapagos Islands. There's around 19 of these islands and a dozen comparatively smaller ones dotted around these slightly bigger islands. Each island obviously has a slightly different environment containing different types of food, different animals, and such and such. And what Darwin discovered was there's these finches, same species, it's a bird, same species of bird on every single island. But what he noted about these finches that was different on every single island was their beaks. Now, some islands, finches had slightly slender, more petite beaks, and then conversely, on other islands, the beaks would be slightly bigger and bulkier. And he asked himself the question, inevitably, why is this? Why are these same species, these finches, varying so much in their beak sizes? Now,
must be a reason for it.
Must be a reason for it. Must be something possibly to do with the environment they find themselves in. So what he found was these finches with different sized beaks fed on different kind of seeds. Now, on some islands where the finches had slightly bigger beaks, he found they would be feeding on seeds that required cracking to get the feed within them. So it makes sense to crack a seed. You need something quite powerful. If you have a bigger beak that's a bit bulkier, a bit more muscle behind it.
Torque.
Yeah. Bit more torque.
Yeah.
Getting erotic about beaks here. Finch beaks.
There are worse things to be erotic about.
Let's not even go down that way. Okay. Yeah. So these finches had bigger beaks to crack open harder seeds to get the feed from within them. Now on these different islands, finches had slender beaks, and he found it was because slightly smaller seeds were hidden within holes of trees and the ground. And so a slender beak would be able to protrude into these holes and gather the seeds out.
Mm.
Now,
and that's an advantage.
That's an advantage. And we're going to come on to that because now we're talking about natural selection through environment. Bam.
Well, so nature and any kind of environment has a way of allowing more resources for something to be replicated. And we've discussed how replication is the be-all and end-all. If something can replicate, it's successful. And how do things replicate? By getting resources. They need things to harness energy and then replicate further and further. So there is a...
Wait, why do they need energy? What do they do with their energy? How can they reproduce their genes?
Well, yeah, so they have to make more genes. I mean...
Sex.
Yeah, sexual reproduction, that's the one.
Sex.
Finch sex.
Big beak finch sex.
It's a good way to remember it. Also, yeah, a good way to get distracted as well. Yeah, talk those beats. So, so then using sexual reproduction, and there are different kinds of natural selection, and there's sexual selection, and then there's natural selection. They can replicate further to be more successful. Replication basically is synonymous with success. So by being able to get this food and by reaching and getting the seeds, that way they can use that energy that's in the seeds to replicate their species and be more
productive.
Yeah, productive,
Evolutionarily
popular, whatever you want to use.
Yeah. So when people talk about fitness, when they're talking about evolution, they're talking about survival value. So how many of their genes they can possibly infiltrate, if you will, into the next generation and then preceding generations after that.
And there's a certain kind of fit that an organism, any particular organism, has on the environment, and the better the fit of the pressures that the environment has onto the potential success or meeting the demands of the environment, the better the fit, the more fit that organism is in the environment. And that's why people use the term fit for particular people.
So if you think a little thought experiment with the Darwin's finches again. So if we take that island who have the finches with the bigger beaks, more bulkier beaks, and you slightly change that environment to make the seeds. Now the seeds are smaller and they're hidden away in holes. So that would mean these bigger beaked finches would have a much harder time getting into these holes and getting their feed. So that would be the environment pressuring a different kind of species or a different kind of like physical adaptation. So in the population of finches upon this island, you might have a more slender beaked finch who is now, due to the change in environment, able to get more feed, able to get more of these seeds, whereas before the bigger beaked finch was able to get more of the seeds. Now that is the essence of natural selection. Now, if we talk about sexual selection now we've got natural selection under our belts, hopefully, if we're good at explaining things, we'll see. So we have natural selection under our belts. Now, sexual selection is, say there's a female who has a more slender beak now and can
fish. It's far more complicated, by the way.
Sexual
selection is far more complicated.
These are thought experiments and simplified versions.
Yeah. So
trust us. So
have faith.
So now
don't have faith. Sorry, don't.
We don't want to encourage
any kind of faith.
any kind of faith-based statistical analysis of the results. So we have natural selection. Now we have sexual selection. So say there's a female who has the slender beak now that is more adapt to fishing out seeds within this environment than the bigger beaks are. They will be selected by partners because they have more energy. I mean, they would have physical traits like they would be more energetic, possibly more, kind of extroverted, more jumping around. They would look healthier.
Yeah.
So therefore, a male, possibly bigger beaked finch would want to mate with her.
Yeah.
And that's, in essence, it's a lot more complicated and stratified, and there's
a lot more potential.
Yeah.
With it.
But that's practically, in a finch nutshell, what we mean by sexual selection.
Yeah, but it's kind of relying on the female appearing to be more healthy. If the female doesn't appear to be more healthy, but is more healthy, then sexual selection doesn't really work.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Ben, actually. You say appear.
Appear.
It's a key word here.
Yeah, I do.
What do you mean by appearing more healthy and successful?
So there has to be some kind of means of communication for the female to communicate to a male that they are more healthy, that they're desirable, that their slender beak is an advantage. And if the male, obviously, we're talking about birds, so they're not exactly very intelligent. So sozzle birds out there. I mean, they have lots of qualities, but I wouldn't say intellect is perhaps their best. So there has to be some kind of way for the male finch to be aware of the fact that this female finch, who has a mutation, so she may appear to be different or strange or gone awry to her species, but there's got to be some way for him to realize that she has an advantage by having a thinner beak. So, by not putting together the fact that a slender beak means that she can get the food and the seeds that he can't, there's got to be some other way that he knows that. So, and unfortunately, it's a bit of a plight, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but the visual system is one that is relied on a lot by most animals. So it's usually some kind of aesthetic means. And the typical example of sexual selection is the plume on a what's it called? Peacock. Yes, sorry, I forgot peacock. Yeah, so on the peacock, that is an incredibly aesthetic creature, and that the sexual selection was relying on the visual system from recognizing, oh, there's an amazing plume that the peacock has, and the better the plume, the more fit and advantageous the organism is. But that turned out to be a lie, basically.
It was a misunderstanding of early evolutionary science.
Yeah, and it happens all the time. There's misunderstandings in evolutionary dynamics, especially in sexual selection, all the time.
All the time.
Yeah, all the time.
So we get to this inevitable scenario where you apply logic to the kind of natural selection and sexual selection, and you kind of ask yourself, well, why doesn't every finch on this island now end up looking the same with exactly the same beak? Because potentially all other beaks would be winnowed out because they just wouldn't be able to survive. They wouldn't be able to get any food and compete with these bigger beaked individuals if the feed and the nuts are hard to crack. So
they just die out. And then
but they don't. There's always some variation within populations.
And perhaps the environment as well. Maybe there's a variation in the environment.
Well, exactly. So I think it's called frequency-dependent evolutionary effects. So there'll always be a kind of rare trait that will be able to survive within a population because it does something different that happens to be advantageous to their survival that the other participants in the population aren't exactly doing.
Yeah.
And that's why you'll always have some kind of variation within species, and that will slowly get selected for, and then it will get winnowed down again because there'll be another rare effect, a rare mutation that gives them that survival advantage. And
it's a swinging kind of pendulum where the rare people get an advantage by being rare, and then they land up being more common because they've got the advantage, and then the same thing happens with the original more common thing.
Or conversely, as Bam mentioned slightly earlier, the environment can change. The environment can change in subtle ways that aids subtle deviations from the population mean.
Yeah.
If you will, from the population
trace. From the peak of the bell curve. Yeah. As we should say.
peak of the standard deviation bell curve. So that's kind of natural selection, environmental pressures, and why there's always variation within population, and always
why
will be.
The variation is essentially the health of the species. Really, if you have a small gene pool with very little variation, you need one thing to go wrong and the whole thing will topple down. You need some bacteria, for example, pretty easy example to use, where it relies on a certain genetic profile, and if everyone's got that genetic profile, then everyone is vulnerable and they'll all die.
Yeah. Hence species death.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Pretty quickly.
Yeah. It will happen pretty. It happens pretty rapidly.
So we could define phenotype and genotype.
Yes. So we usually pass on our genotype through the genes we disseminate to our descendants, through next generation, for our children. And genotype just means our genetic profile.
Yeah.
Basically,
it's just all the genes put together, and that's
our chromosomes. What is in our particular chromosomal profile?
Yeah, and all the base pairs and things. If you want
So that's that. But what gets expressed from those genes,
which is very different,
because it is the phenotype. What gets expressed from those genes is the phenotype. Now, how does that get expressed? Well, genes encode certain types of protein that get transcribed within the cell, and then this protein goes and influences whatever's in the cell at that point. Helps build a body, helps build a survival machine, as Richard Dawkins would famously say in The Selfish Gene. That's the phenotype. Now, of course, the genotype only slightly varies from you get 50% of your parents' DNA, 50% of your other parents' DNA. Yeah. So you do have a slight variation, but you can get more variation from the expression of the phenotype because, of course, the environment plays a pretty big role on the development of someone's phenotype. Now, in the human species, we take a long time to fully mature, around about 24, and 24 years old is when the prefrontal cortex
finally
basically
catches up with the rest of the brain.
Yeah,
we get some higher order thinking there.
And that gives a window for adaptation that you don't get within the genotype.
Yeah,
basically. So that's genotype, that's phenotype.
And there's also extended phenotype, which is a lot more of a head full of a concept. If you're feeling ambitious, then we could try explaining that and see how good our explanatory power is.
I feel ambitious.
Okay, that's good.
So
you can take this one away.
So the extended phenotype was some tidbit of thought that was originated with Richard Dawkins in his book, titled The Extended Phenotype. And what he explains to be an extended phenotype, if we have the understanding of a phenotype is the expression of one's genotype. So therefore, an extended phenotype is something that still acts like it was part of your physical phenotype, your physical body, one of your organs or such.
Yes.
But it operates with the phenotype in making changes to the environment. Now, to get a better grasp of the concept, if you think of a beaver has this reflex to make a dam. And it will always make a dam. You give it the right tools and it would instinctively know how to make a dam. Now, that is...
Even without ever seeing a dam.
Even without ever seeing a dam. It will just... it will be able to make it, construct it, compile sticks to make this kind of dam. And that dam is functioning as something analogous to a phenotype or something within your phenotype. It's helping you survive.
Yeah, it's like an organ in the environment, right?
Yeah.
It's like your phenotype extending into the environment and then making or fulfilling other challenges using the environment. So your phenotype extends further into the environment, which then allows you to perform things that you wouldn't be able to have performed without the environment being there.
Exactly. So Stephen Jay Gould had quite a famous remark where he basically said, quote, "The organism proposes and the environment disposes." So that was the kind of old way of thinking about evolution. You had natural selection and environmental pressures that drove natural selection. And if your phenotype wasn't conducive to the environment, it will get winnowed out. Yeah. Eventually, it won't survive that kind of deviated trait. However, the introduction of the extended phenotype kind of changed that traditional set of thoughts, because now you have a phenotype that is capable of manipulating the environment for beneficial ends. So that kind of changed the whole dynamics of evolution, really, and evolutionary.
Just makes it so much more complicated.
Yeah, because what's an extended phenotype? How is it? Like a extended phenotype again, like a spider's web. So it uses trees and erected things, holes in the environment.
Anything that's there, it will use. But it relies on that environment being in a certain way.
Relies on vertical structures within the environment to tie its webs around. And if you notice, the webs are almost always pretty much in the same shape. So it's a reflex. It's an instinctual thing. A spider doesn't need to watch its mummy spider do a web before it knows how to do a web. Always knows how to do a web and always knows where to do a web. And of course, the web helps catch flies, and it's conducive to their beneficial needs.
Yeah.
So
so obviously it's very necessary, and it's really advantageous to do for an organism to use its environment in the way that genes make a phenotype. The phenotype then manipulates its environment. So it's a really good idea. I think definitely an advantage for genes to be doing that.
Exactly. If you hear a phone going off in the background, That is my co-host Bam being very unprofessional.
Yeah.
Very unprofessional.
Sorry about that. This is this whole podcast thing is new to me. So.
That phone not on silent is not an evolutionary adaptive trait in the podcast world, let me tell you.
Yeah.
The podcast world and the environment will winnow out that kind of
my last
genetic variation. That's it.
You're going to be able to replicate my ideas again.
Replication of ideas. Now,
yes,
that is an interesting topic, because now we get on to something. Because remember, we said initially at the start of the podcast, evolution isn't about genes, but genes is definitely about evolution. Now, remember what we said. Evolution just needs a replicator that can replicate itself quite robustly, but have a few mutations down the line of generations, right? For it to change and see what selection pressures win out. Yeah. Now, we get on to the topic of ideas. Conversing ideas.
The topic of topics, really.
Yeah, replicating ideas, and that's called memetics. Memes.
Memes, you may have heard them. They basically make the internet, but they have a much deeper ideology behind them and meaning. And that is something that's very much less heard about, but it's foundational to the concepts of language, of thoughts, of cultures. Really, culture is a big memeplex, and individuals are claimed to be big memeplexes of all the different ideas and beliefs, and anything that can be replicated from one brain to another. That is what defines a meme. If
you really want to go kind of big on this, think of it as, remember we just spoke about extended phenotypes. Practically what we're doing with our language, we're conveying ideas to from one person to another. Thus, we are using a person's phenotype, another organism, to benefit us by that person receiving our memes or our thoughts and ideas, and we're relying on them, a kind of extended phenotype, to then pass on our own ideas to other people. Gossip about things, gossip about us, how healthy we look, perhaps, or how good our genetic material is,
how well we fit into the environment, things like that, or just ideas and things.
So,
and words as well. Words are replicated from one person to another.
Language. So a really good example of a meme is, there we go. That's it.
Probably won't be able to.
Another example of a meme is language. So words have obviously been replicated down our descended line, and generations. And
now all of us use them.
They've caught on. They're a meme. They've been selected for in their environment. Okay? And why this is a particularly good example of a meme is because language, the English language is pretty much, stayed stable, apart from a few mutations, and words do change, and meanings of words, words take on new meanings. But it's still quite robust in its replication through generations. There's not that many mutations, which makes it a really good candidate for something like a meme. That's a really good example.
Yeah, and that was the sort of fecundity and fidelity, and how stable it is, how easy it's replicated. And I imagine at the beginning, when we were forming our own language, it was pretty volatile. People were disagreeing on what kind of words to use, and people were making new words all the time and forgetting the words that weren't very easy to replicate. So it seems to be there's a period of like extreme volatility first, and then things start to settle down. And the same thing happened with genes and prions.
Oh, prions! What are they?
Oh, well, prions are your worst enemy, basically. They are terrifying, but they're so simple. They're essentially misfolded proteins. They're just a protein that went the wrong way.
We spoke about proteins earlier in the podcast. Basically, it's what makes a phenotype. It's the transition period from a genotype Now, certain genes are transcribed into their protein, the protein that they encode within that gene.
Yeah.
And so a misconstrued protein, you say, is a prion.
Yeah, with the different atoms in the protein, well, one sort of goes the wrong way, and then there's like a charge, and it attracts the other end of the protein, and it essentially folds in the wrong way. And just by it doing that, it has this strange replicatory power where if it comes across another protein, the same protein, it can enforce the same change, the same misfolding that it went through itself. And so then it's replicated. It's the same. It's replicated its misfolding onto another protein, and then you get things a bit like Alzheimer's, for example, where that's kind of similar, or mad cow disease, where it always seems to target the brain. That's what's weird about it.
I guess it's actually prions targeting the brain. It strikes me actually isn't that weird as initially thought, because the brain is so plastic and is malleable, right, to different things.
It's like synaptic plasticity.
Yeah, synaptic plasticity, which is it's just the interval between two cells that communicate with one another in the brain.
It's like when you have a thought that was different to the last thought, that's synaptic plasticity.
Yeah, that's synaptic. And so our brains are always doing that. They all, like now you're listening to this podcast, therefore your brain is slightly changing from the auditory input you're getting from this podcast. You're assimilating new ideas, hopefully, if we're explaining them well enough. And
we need some feedback on
and therefore you're getting your brain is always changing. It's always very malleable. Now I'm guessing because of that malleability, things that aren't so conducive to your brain are able to
make more of a difference.
I think because the brain obviously matures at a later age as well.
Yeah, it can adapt. Organs. Like if the prions just take out half your brain, then over many months, your brain will end up adapting, and you'll recover some of the cognitive prowess that you lost. So there's that level of synaptic plasticity making a rescue for your brain. But I think there's a kind of an element of that in every tissue in your body. Really, the fact it targets your brain, I think it doesn't target the brain because there's synaptic plasticity. But what it does mean is that with people with Alzheimer's, they can lose like 60% of their grey matter, and they're still conscious. They still respond to things. They forget very quickly, but it's bizarre that you can lose more than half of your brain, and you wouldn't be able to tell at all. You'd probably say, oh, they're missing like 30% of their brain, and it turns out it was double that. And I think it's because of synaptic plasticity that's managed to rescue.
So brain regions are able to kind of take on roles of other brain regions that aren't so effective anymore, and etc. Which is obviously a really adaptive trait in terms of evolution.
Yeah.
Because if you have a nervous system that can change with environmental input, and then from that environmental input, it's now more adapted to the environment and operating in the environment. That's clearly a trait that's going to be
that's like a sort of lifetime evolution. It's like happening in the moment. You don't need a gene to make the change. Yeah, you need a meme instead. It's real time. It's like memes are sort of a much more in the moment form of genes, really. I think because they manage to take on the roles that genes normally take on, but they do it from one day to the next instead of from one generation to the next. So instead of a beaver needing the genes that form the circuits for it to understand how to build a dam, instead we don't need those genetic neural circuits. We can just tell someone how to build a dam.
Yeah,
and that's how it's done.
We have communication, language.
Yeah. So memes need language in order to be memes.
It's a kind of one of those things that happened in evolutionary design space, if you will, that has allowed a great adaptive change, like a
massive, suddenly it's a jump in complexity, which I read in Dawkins, where that happens quite a lot, where I think it happened from prions to genes, and genes to memes, and then memes to teams, which is the technological version of things that can be copied.
Yeah, artifacts, cultural artifacts. This projector that's in this room right now.
Yeah.
Like that. Laptop. This very microphone.
Yeah, that's a good point.
This very microphone that is allowing us to convey our memes to you who are listening.
Yeah, and it's also, of course, conveying the team of microphones, because it's the technological concept of a microphone as well as replicating our memes.
Hopefully you completely understood that.
Yeah, I really hope so. We spent a lot of time talking about it.
So a lot of people, obviously religious people, they question evolution a lot, and they question not because most religious people actually accept evolution now. Most.
Yeah.
So you do have the extreme faction that won't acknowledge any kind of scientific reason or reasoning, but most of them accept evolution now. But what they contend with, or what they say, is how on earth can we get any meaning from this? Now we know we're just kind of these we've been selected through natural selection and sexual selection, and we're just kind of like these survival machines that just a load of meat, basically meat and neurons and complexity and proteins.
Yeah.
How do we get any meaning from this? So, Ban, I'll ask you, because it's an interesting question. How do you get meaning from your life having this kind of information? Knowing about evolution.
Yeah.
Believing in it, knowing that you're a descendant of.
Yeah, of all this sort of deterministic,
genes,
it's like the only thing that's meaningful is my free will, and if I'm not made from any form of free will, then I'm just as special as the atoms that I use all the time. But to be honest, I think if you look at it from the other way, and if you say I'm going to assume that there is a God, and then it's like, well, how did God make me? Well, he must have done something really complicated, really bewildering and almost magical. And then it seems like, well, evolution's kind of like that. We went from stardust to here,
exploded stars.
And it managed to happen. So whatever the process is, it must be pretty amazing. No matter what method you use to go from stardust to a conscious being, human beings, I think that's a pretty amazing process. And then when people say, but it's meaningless, and I think, well, it did the job in some ways. So, and I think,
I think
the future is pretty interesting to look at the trajectory that we're going in now. And I think there's a world of possibility. So.
Yes, there is no overarching meaning, as in the case of there's no intelligent designer.
We don't know if there is. I think
I don't. Yeah. Well, in terms of like an intelligent designer giving us our purpose and meaning and what we ought to do. Yeah. Evolution kind of explains, what is, and from what is.
I think you can extract some rules from evolution, and if you say, if we want to continue on the way that we're going, then there's a kind of morality or ethics that we need to follow in order for us to keep going the way that we're going.
Or to improve the way that we're going. Yeah. Because conceivably,
I suppose,
the way we make societies and cultures into a broader sense, it has to be, a certain amount of the population have to enjoy, and it has to be conducive to their biology, the place they live in. It has to be conducive to their biology. And, things like what they get rewarded from, how much suffering makes a goal worth it. All of that.
Utilitarianism.
It needs to map onto our biology. Yeah. Right. And we get better and better at that. We make better and better societies,
But I think, like the extended phenotype, you can end up sort of getting really far away from the simplistic nature of genes and biology, and you'll end up getting to a place where, or having a sort of society, for example, which doesn't seem to have any parallel to the way that you would think the biology would suggest a culture to behave. It seems so be defying our genes.
I guess what would be happening is, because you have different populations that would have slightly different variations of certain genes, then they would be rewarded by different things within a culture. Now, because we're getting more multicultural, our cultures are starting to behave less and less that you would expect a kind of consistent culture that's just mapping onto our genotype to behave in, because there's many genotypes going on,
yeah, I see.
and they're all interacting.
They're all going like super,
and they're going, they're going. No, I actually find pleasure in this, and this is conducive to my biology. And you got the other side going, no, that is not conducive to my biology. That's not how I get happiness. That's not how I assume purpose in this life.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think the way I get meaning,
I think there's massive meaning to evolution.
Massive meaning.
Massive meaning.
I mean, you just go to I was going to say memes. Like, okay, so when you die, our ideas and personalities get to infect and affect other people's minds. And through the utility of an organism's memory or a human being's memory, I will live on forever. My kind of cadences, my predilections, my ideas, hopefully, will be assimilated. Will be assimilated, and they'll be descended upon generations. And that very meme evolution, that's come from genotypic evolution. Just from a simple replicator such as a gene. I think that's pretty meaningful. That the very fact regardless of what any kind of religion wants to pontificate about a life after death, we genuinely can say that we do, to some extent, have a life after death in another person's central nervous system. Yeah, in effect.
So you're kind of defining yourself as your ideas.
Yes.
So you're saying, I am my ideas, and I am what I come up with, my thoughts, that kind of thing.
That's how I think I get meaning from the evolutionary process.
There's some people though who are much more sort of tied to their senses, and they say that my experience is what I am, and not what you think, and not what you come up with. And it can be a somewhat implicit assumption that people make that people say, if I'm not experiencing it, then it's got nothing to do with me, kind of thing. So there's different ways of defining the self, for sure, and that kind of starts to define how you can possibly.
But something. I mean, counteract with that. Some things you're experiencing, you're not even aware that you're experiencing, and they can still be passed on in meme form. Just the way you see someone do something, and the yawn, for example.
Oh yeah.
Everyone yawns in a room. Okay, one person yawns in a room. And you're not even aware that you and Bam yawns right now. You're not even aware.
Don't even need to see a yawn for me to yawn. It just yawns.
You're not even aware you're processing these memes and then passing them on again as well. So, in effect, you are your lived experience, but you also implicitly pass on your lived experience through the evolution of memetics.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's that's a good way, I think, to think about after death. You don't need a kind of eternal life in the supernatural kind of sense. You already have it here on Earth as long as human beings that are able to replicate your ideas, your cadences, your predilections through descendants. Your children.
It sounds sort of intellectually based. It sounds as though
absolutely. I think any meaning has to be
totally.
It has to be based on evolution. Otherwise, what are you getting at?
Yeah.
Okay, if it's not based on evolution, then it's probably not going to be conducive to your biology, and therefore it's not going to make you happy. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, we create these stories to see what's going to work out the best. We create capitalism because we think it's going to work. Some faction of people think it's going to work out the best. Communism think it's going to work out the best. It's just this process of natural selection of ideas.
Yeah, and by so many people agreeing with it, there's got to be some sort of evolutionary advantage to agreeing with the idea.
Yeah,
which is kind of sad, really, because if you want to live on after you die with your ideas and your memes, then you need to be complying with the natural selection pressures of other people's attention. So you've got to be getting their attention and satisfying what they want to hear,
which is interesting,
kind of
which is harder to do these days because of smartphones. We've already had one example today in the podcast of Bam's smartphone gaining his attention.
Yeah, much better than.
Yeah, so to survive in meme form and in life after death, you're relying on people to attend to your ideas and such.
And if they like the idea, you can say truth. You can spout the best idea you can, like Darwin, and no one will replicate it because they just don't like the sound of it.
Yes.
So there's a.
At a certain point, that Darwinian idea,
It's quite sad.
back in like 1859,
Yeah.
it was not conducive to the biology that religious people found themselves with.
Yeah.
We forget, ideas are just neural synapses firing in a certain patterned way, right?
Yeah.
That's biology.
And you get sort of the genetic, almost biological appreciation of certain ideas over others. Some trigger more dopamine to be released than other ideas, essentially.
Dopamine being the reward chemical within our brains, or it's thought to be the reward chemical. Again, that's simplified.
Yeah, of course.
Again, that's simplified. So I think on that note, we'll end the podcast.
Yeah, okay. Well, obviously there's just so much more to talk about, but there's only so much time in the day.
So much time in the day, and there's
only so much time that the sun is out as well. Of course.
Yes.
It's actually a sunny day today. So.
Well, the sun is out at different parts of the world at all times, so
that's true. I should hop on a plane.
That's wrong. Yeah.
Yes.
We'll hop on a plane and continue this podcast. Also, I'm currently doing my dissertation, so I'm pretty damn busy.
Yeah. That's so unfortunate.
It is. It's unfortunate, but when it's done, hopefully it'll be good.
That's pretty head intensive. You've got your dissertation 1 hour and then evolutionary podcast the next.
Hey, so. I'm diverse with my thoughts. This is like a. This is my version of peacocking.
Peacocking.
Peacocking is in like my sexual selection pressures working on me. I'm just boasting about how well I can divide my attention and give out my ideas and create memes in other people.
I'm just boasting.
I'm just going, hey, sexually reproduce with me. I'm not really. I have a go. I have a go.
I was going to say she's whipping you pretty well. If that's the case, maybe trying to appeal to her.
Anyway. Thank you for listening to this podcast, if you did. This was, again, Stuck in the Middle with you. I have been Thomas Cornish, and still am Thomas Cornish.
And I am Bam Kovacs.
You can follow me on Twitter, at Thomas Cornish 1. Do you have a Twitter, Bam?
No, I don't at the moment. I have an interesting Instagram, which is Cogmetics. So if you want to hear about more things concerning memes and concerning the value of people, essentially, and awful aesthetics, then follow Cogmetics on Instagram. You will hear the name even if you don't follow it at some point in the future, because it will be well known.
It will be a good meme. It will be selected for in the meme environment.
Yes, which is, as we've said, very tricky to do.
Yeah. And so you can follow me on Thomas Cornish 1. You can also, I have a little blog going on Quora, Thomas Cornish. You can follow me on there. I've got a few blogs on like politics and culture so far, but there will be more blogs on science and philosophy, things of such, thinking, wisdom, whatever. And eventually we'll have a Stuck in the Middle website and blog that will be up and running.
Nice.
Anyway, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. Work those brain cogs. Take care, guys.
Take care.